Hi, I'm Danny and these are my Diecast Disasters. In this video I'm going to be customising this old Zylmex Chevy Stepside truck into an old farm truck lugging around a tractor tyre. This is the first little Zylmex I've done. Rob from Matchbox Garage also did a Zylmex pickup recently, so I recommend you go and check that out. I'll leave a link in the description. Zylmex Toys, or Zyl or Z Toys, used to make all sorts of toys, not just die-cast ones. I've managed to find reference to this little Stepside truck in the 1979 catalogue under Rough Riders series. We can see somebody's had a jolly good go at repainting this. It's been painted blue, but it's also been repainted a sort of olive drab underneath that. And I think originally it was a black one. They've managed to paint all over the base and the wheels and the windscreen as well. It's actually not a badly detailed model. Nice metal base on it. I'd say it's probably better quality than some of the Ertls and Corgis I've played with. I always feel the decks are a bit small in proportion to the cab on these old Chevys. I think the Fords look more in proportion. So I start by drilling out the two rivet posts. You can see they're sunk in quite a bit there. That's kind of unusual. With the rivets drilled out, it comes apart fairly easily. It's a little bit stuck with paint. It has an interesting two-part base where the grille and exhaust section is holding the wheels on. Another little rivet holding the windscreen in. I have to drill this out and be careful not to drill through the roof of the cab. A little bit of gentle prying with my tool here to break the paint that's still sticking it in. Now I can use some poly stripper to remove the paint. It was actually quite a thick layer of paint on this. This is it after 2 applications of the poly stripper, and I still had to clean up some thick deposits in the corners with my craft knife. Next I give it a clean up with the wire brushes and my rotary tool. This will clean up the rest of the paint that is left and also remove the oxidation from the casting. And here it is after burnishing. You can see it's got quite a rough surface. Normally I might sand that, but it's quite cool as this is going to be a rusty old truck. I'm just going to leave it as it is. There's a couple of holes in the rear gate here. I think there used to be a cover on the back. I guess they held it in some way. I'm not going to want them there, so I'll use some epoxy putty to filler them. This epoxy sets as hard as rock, so I make sure I clean it out of the finer details before it gets too hard. After 10 minutes or so, the putty has cured. I can take my piece of tape off the back and give it a clean up with some files and sandpaper. And now that my holes are tidied up, I can go ahead and primer it with a rust effect. I achieved this with some dark brown primer and then a couple of different colours of rust paint speckled over the top of it. I'm going to use some heavy salt chipping to chip the paint on this vehicle. I brush on some water and I can use that to stick some ground salt onto the truck. I don't want the truck to be quite this rusty, so I use a dry brush to remove some of the salt. I also remove the chipping off of the wheel wells, as I'm not sure they were actually metal. Once I'm happy with my salt application and it's nice and dry, I painted the truck in a sky blue. I want it to look a bit more faded, so I spray over this with a light coat of white. You can see it's heavier and lighter in different areas. I also sprayed a little grey over the wheel arches, although this isn't so noticeable later on in the process. Once the paint was dried, I used a dry brush to brush off the salt, exposing the rust underneath the paint. Next I apply some more rust paints with dry brushing and also patching up the odd area where there's a bit of paint rubbed off or I want it to be a bit more rusty. From the images I've looked at online, the wheel wells seem to still have a sort of a rusty colour to them underneath the paint quite often. It's just more of a rubbed effect rather than chipped. Some of the older models I've looked at definitely appeared to have metal wheel wells as they were quite rusted out, although I'm just not so sure with this particular year. I'm sure somebody can fill me in the comments. Next I add some pin washers to the panel lines. I'm using a black wash. You can also add water streaks with the washers as well. Look out, kitty. Finally, I added just a little bit of rust weathering powders. It was all sealed with a matte varnish. With the body curing, I can move on to the base. I started by scraping off the paint from the metal part here. With the bigger chunks gone, I then clean it up with the wire brush and my rotary tool. The plastic grille and exhaust section has also got quite a lot of paint on it. You can see the rear wheels here are actually stuck in with thick paint. It's also a little bit broken here at the back, but that doesn't matter too much. I use some hot water and baking soda to remove the paint from the plastic parts. Popping the windscreen in there as well. You can see after a couple of minutes the paint is starting to float to the top, and what isn't has been quite weakened. Here they are after a good rinse. I use my little tool here to scrape away the rest of the paint from the base. It's just where it's really thick in the corners. Here it is after cleaning up. Now there is a bumper missing off of this back section here, so I'm going to make a new bumper. I use a couple of pieces of thick styrene sheet, just cut them out, and I glue them together with some Tamiya plastic cement. I applied a generous amount of cement and then held them together in a vise until they were well set. Now I can give them a bit of a file and a sand to smooth it off. That's looking pretty good. Now I just cut off the old broken bumper and glue this one on in its place. I glue the broken section back on. And so here are the parts of our base cleaned up and ready for painting. I hit them both with some black primer. I paint the grille and exhaust section in chrome, and then add some black wash to detail the grille. I add some rust patches. I begin with a darker rust colour and then use a lighter one over the top. And finally add some metallic blue and red weathering powders to the exhaust to give them a sort of a heated effect. The metal section was painted in gunmetal, and then I added some black and rust washes to it. This looks a little bit odd when it's wet, but it gives a nice dirty rusty effect once it's dried. Most of the paint came off of the windscreen with the caustic water. What's remaining is pretty easy to just sand off. It's looking a lot cleaner. Now I give it a polish. There, that's looking pretty good. Now to add some weathering to it, I'm going with some dust weathering powder. This was rubbed all over it. It was actually quite hard to hold on to. Once it was nice and dusty, I used a clean cotton bud to add the wiper blade marks. The old Zylmex wheels are fairly horrible, so I'm going to replace them with these little ones. They're actually quite small, so I didn't have a lot of options, but I think these ones look quite good. I'm going to have to give them a bit of a paint job though. I start by painting the hubs with steel, then I add a couple of washes to dirty them up a bit. I want something to go in the back of my truck, so it's going to be a tractor tyre. I've got this nice looking one here from an old toy. It's a bit grubby, so I pop it apart and give it a wash in some hot soapy water. It's got a nice Dunlop logo on it. There's a big fat axle shaft at the back here, so I'll just chop that off with my craft knife. Next I paint the rim with a rust effect. I add some salt chipping, done this quite heavily. I then painted it red and added some thin white over the top. Now I can scrape off my salt, revealing the rust underneath. And here it is with the tyre put back on and a bit of mud weathering powder added. Finally, the interior was pretty clean actually, just a little bit of dust, so I give it a wipe with a brush and then some white primer and finish it with some brown paint and a light toned wash. So after a bit of work, here are all the parts of our Chevy Stepside ready to go back together. But first we'll just take a moment to look back and be reminded of what we started with. A little blue beast, our Zylmex Stepside Chevy from 1979, slathered with 3 thick layers of paint including the windscreens. It's got a missing bumper and chrome missing from the grille and horrible old wheels. And here it is after our custom rusty farm truck makeover. It's still blue, but it's now heavily rusted. It's had some more realistic old wheels added. It's had the rear bumper replaced. And it's been put to work out on the farm, lugging around the old tyre from the tractor. So I hope you like the way it came out. I really enjoy doing these heavily rusted old trucks. They're really good fun. You can let me know what you think in the comments down below. Maybe you used to have an old Chevy like this. Maybe you even used to use one as a farm truck. Or maybe you used to have some Zylmex or Z toys that you used to play with. It's always great to hear people's memories. I'll now say a big welcome to all of my new subscribers and a big thanks to everyone for the awesome comments and likes on my videos. As always, an extra special thanks to my awesome Patreon supporters who help to support the channel through Patreon. If you'd like to help as well, you can check out my Patreon page. There's a link in the description below. Also, remember to check out Rob's little Zylmex pickup. I'll leave a link for that in the description as well. And that just leaves me to say thanks heaps for watching. If you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and share it with your friends.